Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, we're honored to be joined by two distinguished scholars. To my right, Dr. William Sorrell, Professor Emeritus of African and African American Studies at Lehman College. And to my left, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He is an African American historian and who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. We are honored to be joined by a scholar of over 30 books and 100 scholarly articles. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you. Thank you.
We just heard part one where you both talked about your new work, the counter-revolution of 1776, and just the fact that you've taken a really bold look at history and basically asking some very sharp questions about the perceptions that people have about American history. I know that, there's a place in Virginia where people go to really revisit history, and you see that the image of us, particularly looking at the U.S. and looking at early America and reflecting on fighting for freedom and justice. But your book particularly looked at it from another perspective. And we're going to talk about, from the works that you've done over the years, as well as the works that Dr. Seraile has, how do we fill the missing pages of history? So basically, my first question for both of you is, as historians and thinkers, how have you used your scholarship to include or to fill the missing pages of history, and what has been the perception of those who have witnessed your work and the responses? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Horne.
Well, fortunately, because of struggles, militant struggles, progressive struggles, it's easier to write more accurate history. That is to say that in the 1930s, for example, even though there were struggles, they had not reached a peak. And so therefore, it was possible to write slanderous, defaming history of black people. And that's why W.B. Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction, which gives a new interpretation of the post-Civil War period, talking about how black people were trying to install democracy in Dixie. That's one of the reasons why it was scorned and derided by so many historians until, say, the 1950s, 1960s, when there is more of a mass movement, more of a progressive struggle, and then it becomes a dominant interpretation. So we have to recognize that history is very much attuned to and aligned with the natures of people's struggles, for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Seraile.
Well, one thing I've been trying to do all the time in my personal research is to write about either people or institutions or events that have been ignored or probably forgotten. I don't necessarily believe in being like the 15th historian to write about George Washington, Carver, or Booker T. Washington. I'd rather explore new territories. And in doing so, I look at sources that usually have been ignored or just not even aware of. Because, for example, I did my studies on Theophilus Gould Stewart. I was able to find 3 boxes of his writings that were in the basement of his granddaughter in Columbus, Ohio. I probably was maybe the second or third person ever to see them. The other 2 were not historians; they were family members.
Mm-hmm. So in line with the fact that both of you, from talking about someone like Theophilus Gould Stewart, who many people don't know, but he definitely made his mark in history. And can you briefly, for those who are not familiar, tell us who he was?
Well, he was someone who could have passed for white just based on complexion. He grew up in a place called Gouldtown, New Jersey, in the town of Bridgeton. Came from a family that was free, going back to the late 1600s when there was the union between the granddaughter of Lord Fenwick and Gould, an African. And from that union became free families. And as a result, what you have is someone who was very instrumental in the African Methodist Episcopal Church as a scholar, as a thinker, who wrote 7 books himself, and someone who was a social commentator. He went to the Philippines as a chaplain in the military, able to observe Filipino culture, as well as observe culture, say, in Brooklyn when he was pastor of Bridge Street Church. And unfortunately, a lot of times people like Theophilus Stewart, well known in their own time period, but then they get forgotten about after they die. Unless someone like myself come around and say, hey, let's revive this person and let's tell the world all about the contributions.
Can I add a footnote
Yes.
to what Bill just said? In terms of sources, I think going forward in this century, younger historians should be trying to do research in different languages other than English, because as Bill was just saying, you had black people going to the Philippines, all over the world, in fact. And so our story is there, and oftentimes it'll be found in sources other than English. And tacked on is the second point, which is that archives in different countries too. I mean, certainly from my research on slavery, a lot of the richest sources that I found are Portugal, which at one time was the captain of the African slave trade in London. My book on Haiti, I had to do research in France, since Haiti was a former French colony. So those are the 2 points I would like to stress to the younger historians in your audience.
Thank you for sharing that.
And third is, sometimes young historians or even old historians have a tendency to have built-in biases, and they only want to look at maybe certain kinds of records. I look at everything. I don't care if it's racist or not. What I'm looking for is that little bit of history that is pertinent. Let me just give you an example. I wrote an article, it's about education of African Americans, and I was going through these racist New York newspapers, and one was talking about darkies at a school. I ignored that part. What captured me was they gave the name of the principal, they gave the name of how many students were in the school, and they gave me the location of the school. Everything else that was racist, okay, that's the author at that time. But I got those little nuggets.
Dr. Horne, you've written on numerous topics which range from one of your books, Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois, and African American response to the Cold War, to the Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s, and also Race Women, the lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois, amongst a number of topics. And you've also explored the blacklisting in Hollywood. Please think of all these works. What was the goal there? What was your focus in terms of looking at uncovering some of these untold stories? What has been the response? What has led you? How do you go about selecting the topics to do research?
Well, with regard to selecting topics, since I'm a historian, I'm not a novelist, I can't make things up, so I need sources. And so even if I come up with a good topic, if there are no sources for it, that usually means it's a non-starter. With regard to selecting a topic, oftentimes it's like the 1776 book. I'm trying to think of something many times that I think doesn't make any sense, some sort of prevailing interpretation of history that doesn't make any sense, like slave owners leading a struggle for liberation and freedom, for example, even though they're enslaving and manacling and handcuffing thousands upon thousands of Africans. That never made any sense to me. So I wanted to explore that topic. So it really depends upon the topic. I mean, I have a book coming out in a few months on the Haitian Revolution. And what I wanted to show there was how the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, shook up the entire planet, but particularly shook up the Americas, and particularly shook up the United States of America, and played a central role in pushing the United States towards slavery, and therefore we all owe a debt of gratitude to Haiti. And so I wanted to make that point, which obviously has contemporary resonance, given the difficulties that Haiti is going through now. And I'm hoping that after this book comes out, it'll lead to more solidarity, for example, with struggling Haiti. So those are some of the points that undergird some of the work that I'm doing.
I came, just what Dr. Horne was saying, I came across the article, or actually it was a document, maybe you have seen it, right after Nat Turner's revolution in 1831. And I don't remember the name of the author, but it said basically, white people beware, what happened in Haiti is coming here. And it added that there were already agents, there were Haitians who already came here, and they were just waiting for the moment, for the time to strike. You ever come across that?
in that ballpark, but send me that source, because I can probably...
I don't know offhand. You know, you're doing your research and you come across
Yeah,
things.
yeah. Well, my point in this book is going to be that if you look at the major slave revolts in North America, be it Gabriel's Revolt circa 1800, Denmark Vesey circa 1822, Nat Turner circa 1831, the major revolt in Barbados circa 1816. I could go on, but all of them, to a degree, have Haitian fingerprints all over them, because like revolutionaries elsewhere and everywhere, the Haitians wanted to spread their gospel, their abolitionist gospel. And plus they recognized that for their own survival, it would be very difficult to have an abolitionist island in a sea of slavery. So it was in their enlightened self-interest to see that slavery would be abolished everywhere, and they proceeded upon that assumption.
Now, one of your books, which I found, very fascinating title, when you talk about, it's called The Color of Fascism, Louise Dente, Racial Passing and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism in the United States. Tell us about that book, and just to share with their audience what inspired you to really pursue that topic.
Well, Louise Dente was born a Negro in the late 19th century in Atlanta, but he was melanin deficient, he was very light-skinned, and at a certain point he decided it was hard out here being a Negro. So, as you probably know, at one time there was this phenomenon called passing, where those who were lighter skinned would say bye-bye to the Negroes and then try to, quote, pass, unquote, as, quote, white, unquote. And he was one of those, but he turned out to become the leader of the fascist movement in the United States in 1930. He was meeting with all the top fascist leaders, Mussolini and et al. And if World War II had gone a different way, he probably would have been ruling the United States of America. I mean, he was very angry with the United States because he felt that in order to pass, he had to say goodbye, obviously, to all of his dark-skinned relatives. So he has a lot of anger. And, of course, he's put on trial and barely escapes being convicted. Although after World War II, he has certain influence on the rising conservative movement. For example, William F. Buckley, who's now passed away, who was considered the godfather of modern-day conservatism, had a relationship with Louise Dente. I've often thought that book needs to be made into a movie. I don't know why it hasn't been yet.
He sounds like DrSeraile.
Yes.
So, I mean, you think about that, history that you uncovered, and that I'm sure not even a lot of African Americans are familiar, or other Americans, okay? And also you had written about one book entitled Class Struggle in Hollywood, 1930 to 1950, moguls, mobsters, stars, Reds, and trade unionists. Tell us about that work.
Well, it's interesting how this works, because actually when I started that book in the 90s, I was concerned about all of the publicity that gangster rap was getting. And a lot of the people who are writing about it, they just look at the lyrics, they just look at the rappers, and then they start writing. But there's a political economy of the music industry. I mean, there are companies, corporations, who put out these products. And I decided that it was easier to write about this in terms of movies, because there are more archives, there are more sources. And I was basically telling a story of how the movie industry, and in fact the entertainment industry in general, is so heavily gangster influenced. I mean, there are gangsters who are basically running these industries. My joke is that one of the reasons you have so many gangster movies and have so much gangster rap is because gangsters run the industry. If professors were running the industry, it would be professor rap, for example. You'd have all these movies glorifying professors. And so that's what that book was about. Once again, I can't understand why it hasn't been turned into a movie.
Well, hopefully with the conversation being discussed, and I totally agree with you, someone out there will say, wow, we should have did this. But, this is why these conversations are so vital. And I know, Dr. Seraile, you've written about several conversations, one of which is about the whole New York colored Orphan Society and that history, and I know that maybe you can talk a little bit about that in terms of how it actually has connected people with their past, and stuff. So tell me a little bit about that.
The orphanage was started in 1836 by Quakers, because Quakers were in the forefront in the abolitionist movement, and also in terms of reaching out to help our community. They started with the colored home for the aged. And they even Quakers who were told you cannot be a slave owner and be a Quaker. So some of them established settlements in Ohio for enslaved people in North Carolina. So they were certainly being very, very benevolent and Christian in a true sense. The orphanage went to 1946 as an orphanage, and then it became child welfare in the sense of families taking care of children, foster care. Today it exists as Harlem Dowling West Side Center for Children and Family Services. What was rewarding to me as a researcher and a historian is I met people who were in the orphanage. I met some like about 12 years ago. I had them in my home for a meal, and since then there've been several reunions. And these are ordinary people. I mean, ordinary in the sense, the police officers and nurses and teachers just happen to have the misfortune of being placed in an institution when they were growing up. Historically, there were a number of famous people. I'll just tell you about one, and one was named James Henry Gooding. And those who saw the movie Glory about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, he was a member of that regiment. And he was the one who wrote a letter to President Lincoln in 1864, basically saying, are we laborers or are we soldiers? And if we're soldiers, then why are you paying us as if we are laborers? And that was a very well-known letter to historians. He was captured and he died in a very infamous prison camp called Andersonville in Georgia. It was so infamous that the commander, who was a German immigrant, was executed. Only person executed for the Civil War in terms of crimes. The thing about the orphanage and my works and Dr. Horne's works, as he said earlier, are source materials. The orphanage has its records in the National Archives, in the New York Historical Society. And I want to thank Dr. Horne because he's the one who told me. He said, you're looking for another project? He said, I came across, because when he does research, he comes across, and he does like 4 or 5 projects at the same time. And I don't know why you didn't write about the orphanage, Gerald, but he passed it on to me.
I knew it was a good man.
He passed it on to me because I knew of the orphanage, but the only thing I knew was everybody else knew it got burned down in 1863 by the Irish during the draft riots. And I didn't know very much. I just assumed it went out of business. And I went on to the New York Historical, and they have all these records. Children were indentured, medical records, and so forth. So thanks, Gerald.
Now, tell the audience what's the title of this book.
It's called Angels of Mercy, White Women and the History of New York's Colored Orphan Asylum. That wasn't my original title, and Gerald probably knows this very well. You got to sort of negotiate with publishers when you're coming up with titles. Sometimes they like your original one. Sometimes they say, well, for publicity purposes, we need to have something a little bit different. But the thing that I call them angels, but angels, at least in this case, human angels also have defects. And one of the defects that I criticized about the management of the orphanage, there was less than a tendency to reach out to the African American community. It was sort of like, well, we know better how to take care of your children than you do. So that was one of my criticisms. But overall, I mean, they were angels because at least in 1946, there were about 15,000 children who were taken care of.
And so as we think about and really examine the works that both of you have done in terms of uncovering history, and this is American history, uncovering the untold story and really filling those missing pages. Now I'm just going to, again, go back to the question, and my biggest concern is about the revision of African American history. As you know, as I said, we talked about the fact that there are certain states, Texas, California, that are going, this whole movement of changing and watering down the horrors of enslavement to change, and the concern that this might filter across the country. What can we do, you do, as historians, as scholars, to somehow get the word out there to prevent this becoming a trend?
It's a very easy answer, and the answer is political. People think it's educational. You got to think, how did it happen that Texas and other states can dominate textbook publications? It's because they were the ones who decided on a very local level, we're going to run and control the school boards. And once you control the local school boards and then you know, say countywide and even statewide, then you can determine the curriculum. So if we progressive people say we want to be in charge of all the school boards, then we can dictate too curriculum, selection of textbooks, so forth. Otherwise, it's just like fighting, and the textbooks company is going to say, well, you know, Texas is a huge market, which it is, and we cannot accommodate you progressive people in Manhattan. We got to deal with Texas, and that's the answer, I believe.
Well, Bill is right, and I think that another way to look at it, of course, is that we need to build a movement, number one. Historians need to take up this issue in their professional associations, number two. The American Federation of Teachers, United Federation of Teachers, obviously needs to have a task force on this kind of question. Community school boards and charter schools need to weigh in on this question. Senators and congresspersons need to be apprised of our point of view. I think that it's possible to push back this tide, but the tide will wash us all away unless we do push back.
And in line with that, let's look at the curriculum, okay? I know that through your mutual careers, you have been about filling those missing pages and telling and putting out information that is not commonly known. But we still see that for most part, our children are not getting a full, balanced view of history. To the next generation of historians that are coming after you, that are going to be picking up the baton 20, 50 years from now, what type, I'm sure you will, and your work is just monuments in terms of passing that baton, but how can we get and encourage young men and women to think, like you both have, outside the box, to want to scratch the surface beyond what's right in front of them as U.S. history and actually go beyond? Because both of you have actually scratched the surface and actually gone beyond what the notions of what history is. What recommendations do you have to those coming out of the
I don't
universities?
think it'd be that difficult, because I think anyone who has the patience and the diligence and the intelligence to get a PhD in history, whether it's American history, European history, whatever history, are people who are very inquisitive and who would like to, like we have done, find an area that has not been written about. Because if you do that, it helps make you famous. And then it helps to make other people depend upon your research, because your research is, say, like the building block, and they can come and they can keep adding to it. So I think they would do it. Again, it's sort of a political thing, because you have publishers, and publishers will publish what they think will sell. And if they don't think it's going to sell, then they say, no, not now, maybe 10 years from now. But I think going back to another question about education, a lot of students don't learn Chinese in school. They learn Chinese after school. A lot of people don't learn about their culture in school. They learn it, say, on a Saturday. Right across the street from my house here in Harlem, there are Africans from Senegal. I see young children there on Saturdays. They're learning maybe their own language, the Wolof, and they're learning certainly about Senegalese culture and traditions, because it's not part of the school system. I think too often we have a tendency to depend upon the schools. Well, if they're in school, they'll learn it in school. I never learned it in school.
Exactly.
I learned it in the libraries on my own.
Exactly. Dr. Horne?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to think of anything else to add to that, but I will say this in terms of a message to younger historians. I'd like to reiterate that learning different languages is going to be critical in the 21st century, not only for historians, I would say for everyone, and that's what I would like to underscore.
Which languages do you think?
Oh, well, you mentioned Chinese, Arabic, Swahili, French, Spanish, German.
So on that note, as we conclude in terms of looking at, and again, I just want to take this opportunity on behalf of Cultural Caravan to salute both of you. The work, the commitment to telling our story, and actually really having information that can be used for generations to come. And just to give you an opportunity for closing thoughts as we conclude this episode, Dr. Horne.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to share this time with Cultural Caravan, and I look forward to coming here to New York again to share more time with you.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Dr. Seraile?
I think you ought to salute yourself because you're giving the audience an opportunity to learn things that they are not finding anyplace else, because we don't have Gilton Noble and Like It Is anymore. And we don't have a lot of the programs that we had in the late 60s and the 70s. So what you're doing is remarkable, and I think your audience appreciates what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I thank you both. And again, on behalf of Cultural Caravan, we hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.